Part 1. The boy who would shake the world. There are some men who rise through privilege, protected by power from the very beginning. And then there are those rare figures who emerge from hunger, loss, betrayal, and fear, forged not by comfort, but by survival. Genghis Khan belonged to the second kind. He was not born into certainty. He was not handed an empire. He began life in the unforgiving Mongolian steppe, in a world where loyalty could vanish overnight, where families were abandoned to starve, and where only the ruthless or the resilient lived long enough to matter. And yet from that brutal beginning came the man who would build the largest contiguous land empire in human history. How does a child with almost nothing become a name that echoes across continents? How does Temujin, a boy abandoned in the wilderness of tribal warfare, become Genghis Khan, the ruler who would make both Asia and Europe tremble? To understand the conqueror, we first have to return to the harsh world that shaped him. Because long before he commanded armies, he was simply a child of the steppe, born into a land already preparing him for war. Part 2. Born into the harsh world of the steppe. Most historians place Temujin's birth around the year 1162, though even that date is not completely certain. He was born into the Borgian clan, one of the Mongol tribal lineages that moved across the vast grasslands of northeastern Mongolia. His birthplace is usually associated with the upper Anan River, near the sacred mountain Birken-Kaldon, a landscape of open plains, bitter winters, and endless movement. This was not a settled world of stone cities and permanent borders. It was a world of horse herds, shifting alliances, and constant danger. Temujin's father, Yasuge, was a Mongol chieftain, a man with enough authority to command followers, but not enough power to guarantee safety for his family. The steppe did not reward weakness, and it did not respect bloodline unless that bloodline could defend itself. Around Temujin were rival peoples and competing tribal confederations: the Mongols, the Karaite, the Merkit, the Tatars, and the Naiman. Beyond them stood larger powers, including the Jin dynasty in North China, the Tangut kingdom of Western Xia, the forest peoples to the north, and the Islamic lands of Central Asia far to west. This was the world Temujin entered, divided, suspicious, and already shaped by conflict. Before he ever dreamed of ruling it, he first had to survive it. Part 3. A childhood trained by hardship. From an early age, Temujin was shaped by the demands of steppe life. Like other boys born into the nomadic world, he learned to ride horses, shoot arrows, hunt game, and endure cold, hunger, and exhaustion without complaint. These were not noble skills meant for sport. They were the difference between living and dying. On the Mongolian steppe, a child grew up quickly because the land itself allowed no softness. He also grew up in a family where status did not guarantee security. His mother, Holon, was a strong and capable woman. But even in his father's household, Temujin was not protected by any clear promise of inheritance or power. That uncertainty mattered. It meant that from childhood, he lived in a world where position could be challenged. Loyalty could shift, and survival often depended on reading people as carefully as reading the land. During these early years, Temujin also formed one of the most important bonds of his life with Jamuga. The two became close companions and swore the oath of Anda, a sacred brotherhood that carried deep meaning on the steppe. At the time, it must have seemed like the kind of bond that would last forever. But in a world built on rivalry, ambition, and fragile alliances, even the strongest friendship could one day become something else. And for Temujin, that lesson was coming sooner than anyone could have imagined. Part 4. Betrothed young, then thrown into chaos. When Temujin was about 9 years old, his father Yasuge took him to the camp of the Angharat, where a marriage alliance was arranged with Bert, the daughter of Dai Sechin. On the steppe, marriage was never only personal. It was political, practical, and tied to survival. Yasuge was not a great ruler with endless wealth, and the modest bride gift he offered reflected that reality. Temujin was left there for a time, as was customary, while the bond between the two families began to take shape. At that age, he could not have known that this moment, meant to secure part of his future, would be followed almost immediately by disaster. On his journey home, Yasuge encountered a group of tatters. They invited him to share a meal, but the hospitality was a lie. He was poisoned. By the time word reached Temujin and he was called back, his father was dying. Whatever stability the family still possessed collapsed in an instant. A boy who had just been placed on the path toward adulthood was suddenly pulled back into a world of grief, fear, and uncertainty. The protection of a father was gone. The fragile order of the household was about to break apart. And for Temujin, this was only the beginning of a far more brutal struggle than anyone around him could yet see. Part 5. Abandoned, starving, and forced to choose survival after Yasuge died. Temujin's family quickly learned a cruel truth about life on the steppe. Whatever loyalty his father had once commanded did not remain with his widow and children. Holan tried to hold the family together and preserve some authority, but she could not stop the collapse. The followers who had once ridden under Yasuge's leadership abandoned them, leaving the household to fend for itself in near total poverty. What followed was not a temporary hardship. It was a fight to stay alive. Temujin, his brothers, and his mother survived by gathering roots, catching fish, and hunting whatever small food they could find. Hunger became part of daily life. In that kind of desperation, even family ties began to strain. Food was too scarce, tempers were too raw, and every scrap mattered. Tension grew between Temujin and his full brother Kasar on one side, and their older half-brother Begder on the other. Begder had begun asserting his authority over the family, especially over food and resources. And in a household already breaking under pressure, that became intolerable. Eventually, the conflict turned deadly. Temujin and Kasar killed Begder. It was a shocking act, but it revealed the world Temujin was growing up in. This was not a childhood shaped by mercy. It was shaped by fear, scarcity, and brutal decisions made too early. Holan was furious, not only because a son had killed his brother, but because she understood what this meant. If the family continued tearing itself apart, none of them would survive. And soon, Temujin would learn that the dangers facing him were not only inside the family, but closing in from outside as well. Part 6. Captured, escaping, and finding his first true ally. The killing of Begder did not simply disappear into the hardships of family life. It gave Temujin's enemies an excuse to move against him. The Taishad, a rival group with reasons to resent the Borjigin line, seized the opportunity and captured him. Still young, and not yet the leader he would become, Temujin was suddenly reduced to a prisoner, humiliated and restrained. His future narrowed to whatever his captors decided to do with him. For many, that might have been the end of the story. But Temujin was already learning one of the most important lessons of his life. Survival often depended on timing, nerve, and the willingness of one person to act. He managed to escape, and according to tradition, he was helped by a sympathizer who chose to protect him instead of handing him back. That moment mattered. In a world filled with betrayal, it showed him that loyalty could still be found, but only if it was earned. When he returned to his family, life was still painfully fragile. They had little left, and even the few animals they depended on could be taken in an instant. At one point, horse thieves stole 8 of the family's 9 horses, a devastating blow for people whose entire survival depended on mobility. Temujin set out to pursue them, and along the way he met a young man named Bo-Orku. That meeting would change everything. Bo-Orku did not know Temujin as a great Khan or rising conqueror. He knew him only as a young man in need, and yet he chose to help him anyway. Together they tracked the stolen horses and recovered them in a bold night raid. It was a small victory by later standards, but it carried enormous meaning. Temujin was no longer just surviving alone. He was beginning to inspire the kind of loyalty that could outlast fear. And soon, that loyalty would be tested in a far greater crisis when the woman promised to him would be torn away by force. Part 7. Burt taken and the rescue that changed everything. By the time Temujin was around 16, he returned to the Anjarat and married Burt, the girl to whom he had been promised years earlier. After everything he had already endured, this marriage may have seemed like the beginning of stability, a chance to build a household of his own after so much loss. But peace did not last. About 2 years later, disaster struck again. A force of Merkit raiders descended on Temujin's camp. Their attack was not random. It was rooted in an older grievance tied to Temujin's family, and Burt became the target. She was seized and carried off, while Temujin was left facing a devastating truth. He was not yet strong enough to take her back alone. So he turned to the one thing the steppe valued almost as much as strength: alliance. Temujin appealed to Togrul, the powerful ruler of the Karaite, reminding him of the old bond between Togrul and his father Yesige. He also drew support from Jamyuga, the blood brother of his youth. Together, they formed a coalition and moved against the Merkit. The campaign was swift and effective. The Merkit were defeated, and Burt was recovered. But even in reunion, there was uncertainty. During her captivity, Burt had become pregnant. The child, Joki, would always carry the shadow of that question, and yet Temujin accepted him as his son. That decision mattered more than it may seem. It revealed something powerful about him even at this stage of his life. He was not only a man driven by vengeance or pride. He understood the value of loyalty, of family, and of holding together what others might have let fracture. In rescuing Burt, he had done more than reclaim his wife. He had proven that he could call on allies, lead a response, and emerge stronger from humiliation. For the first time, Temujin was no longer just a survivor of the steppe's cruelty. He was becoming a man others would follow. Part 8. A rising leader and a friend who became his rival. By his early 20s, Temujin was no longer just a young man trying to protect his family. He was becoming a leader with real influence, someone who attracted followers not because of inherited greatness, but because people were beginning to see something in him: resolve, courage, and an unusual ability to bind others to his cause. On the steppe, that kind of rise never went unnoticed. It earned respect, but it also created fear. And no one understood that better than Jamyuga. Once, Jamyuga had been Temujin's closest companion, his Anda, his sworn brother. But the steppe was not a world where old loyalty always survived new ambition. As Temujin's name grew, so did the distance between the two men. They did not simply represent two rival leaders. They represented two different visions of power. Jamyuga was more closely tied to the traditional aristocratic order of the steppe, the old world of noble rank and inherited standing. Temujin, by contrast, was increasingly drawing support from men whose loyalty came from merit, hardship, and personal devotion rather than ancient privilege. That difference mattered. It meant Temujin was building something new. Around him gathered men who would later become legendary, figures such as Jelm and Subday, followers whose value lay not in noble birth, but in talent and commitment. At the same time, his household continued to grow. Burt gave birth to Gedai, further strengthening the family line. Then, around 1186, Temujin was recognized as Khan of the Borjigin. It was a major step, but it also raised a dangerous question. Could a man who had risen from abandonment and hunger truly overcome the old powers of the steppe? Or had his rise only set the stage for an even more bitter struggle still to come? Part 9. Defeat, silence, and the return of Temujin. Rising on the steppe was one thing. Staying there was another. Temujin soon faced a crushing setback when he was defeated by Jamyuga at the Battle of Dale and Baljid. For a man whose power was still growing, This was more than a lost fight. It was a reminder that ambition alone could not overcome the older and better established forces gathering against him. Jamyuga was not just a rival with personal history. He was the standard-bearer of a competing political order, and for a time, it seemed that Temujin's rise might end before it had truly begun. Then something striking happened. The sources grow quiet. For several years, Temujin nearly disappears from the historical record, suggesting a period of weakness, retreat, or even near political collapse. It is likely that he lost many of his followers and was forced into a kind of political exile, waiting for the right moment to re-emerge. For another man, that silence might have marked the fading edge of a failed career. For Temujin, it became a period of survival, patience, and preparation. When he returned to prominence in the mid-1190s, he did not come back as a desperate fugitive. He came back as a man ready to seize opportunity. During conflicts involving the Jin dynasty and the Tatars, Temujin fought successfully against the Tatars and gained valuable spoils, prestige, and momentum. Just as importantly, he renewed his alliance with Togrul and helped restore him to power among the Karaite. It was the kind of comeback that changed everything. Temujin had fallen, vanished, and then returned stronger, more experienced, and far more dangerous than before. Part 10. Victory after victory, and the making of an unstoppable force. By the late 1190s and the early years of the new century, Temujin was no longer fighting simply to recover what he had lost. He was expanding, striking rival tribes with growing confidence, and proving again and again that his return had not been temporary. Campaigns against the Merkit, the Naiman, and other enemies across the steppes steadily increased his power, while each victory brought him more followers, more resources, and more fearsome prestige. His enemies saw the danger clearly. Jamyuga, still determined to stop him, was raised by a coalition of tribes as a kind of universal Khan, a leader meant to unite the steppe against Temujin's rise. On paper, it was a powerful answer, but in reality, the coalition was weaker than it appeared. Some of those aligned against Temujin were already feeding him information, whether out of caution, admiration, or the growing suspicion that history was beginning to move in his direction. Temujin knew how to use that weakness. In one campaign, harsh weather and a snowstorm threw his enemies into confusion, helping tilt the struggle in his favor. In another crucial clash at Khoitan, the fighting came dangerously close to ending his life. Temujin was struck in the neck by an arrow, a wound that could easily have killed him. But one of his most loyal followers, Jelm, saved him, tending to him with extraordinary devotion at the risk of his own life. And then came one of the most revealing moments of Temujin's rise. When the man who had shot him was identified, Temujin did not simply order his execution. Instead, he spared him and brought him into his service, giving him the name Jeeb. That decision said everything. Temujin was not building his power like a tribal chief, bound by pride and revenge. He was building it like a ruler who recognized talent wherever he found it, even in an enemy. With men like Jelm and Jeeb at his side, Temujin was becoming more than a successful war leader. He was assembling the kind of inner circle that could help him reshape the steppe itself. Part 11. Betrayal, collapse, and the oath that held everything together. As Temujin's power continued to grow, so did the desperation of the men who wanted to stop him. Jamyuga began building yet another alliance, drawing support from the Naiman and from defectors who had once stood closer to Temujin himself. This was no longer just a contest between two rivals. The steppe was dividing around a larger question: who would shape its future, the old aristocratic order or the new kind of leadership Temujin was creating? Even under that pressure, Temujin kept adapting. He fought with speed, flexibility, and a growing sense of command, using both open battle and smaller, more fluid methods of war to wear down opponents who still underestimated him. But the greatest danger did not come only from Jamyuga. It came from the collapse of one of Temujin's most important relationships. His alliance with Togrul, the Karaite ruler who had once helped him rescue Bert and return to power, began to unravel. Political tension deepened, especially around marriage arrangements and the influence of Togrul's son, Ilka, who saw Temujin less as an ally and more as a threat. Distrust turned into open hostility. Then, in 1203, disaster struck. Temujin was defeated by the Karaite and forced to flee. Much of his strength was shattered, and only about half his forces remained with him. After all he had built, he now faced one of the darkest moments of his life. Once again pushed to the edge, hunted, weakened, and surrounded by uncertainty. But this time, he did not break. At a place remembered as Baljuna, Temujin and the loyal men who had stayed beside him made a solemn oath. They bound themselves together in hardship and promised to fight on, no matter how desperate the situation became. That vow was more than a moment of survival. It was the emotional core of the new order Temujin was forging, a brotherhood held not by tribe or blood alone, but by loyalty proven in defeat. And from that broken, battered remnant, he was about to rise one more time. Part 12. The Fall of Togrul, the Destruction of the Nayman, and the Unification of the Steppe. After Baljuna, Temujin moved with the urgency of a man who knew there would be no second chance. He rebuilt fast, gathered new support, and restored contact with key allies, including his brother Khazar. What had looked like collapse soon became recovery, and recovery quickly turned into revenge. When the moment came, Temujin struck the Karaite with force and precision. The fighting lasted for days. This was not a minor raid or a passing clash between rival tribes. It was a decisive struggle for survival and supremacy. In the end, the Karaite were broken. Togrul, once Temujin's protector and ally, fled the battlefield but did not escape his fate. He was killed while trying to run. With that, one of the great powers of the steppe fell, and Temujin absorbed the Karaite into his growing dominion, declaring the union of the Mongols and Karaite under his rule. The one final major rival still stood in his path. The Nayman remained the strongest force capable of resisting him, and the coming campaign would determine whether Temujin would truly rule the steppe or remain only the strongest among several warlords. In 1204, he moved against them with an army that was not only hardened by years of war, but increasingly organized in a new way. He arranged his forces in decimal units of tens, hundreds, and thousands, creating a structure that made his army more disciplined, more flexible, and far more effective than the tribal coalitions arrayed against him. He also understood the value of fear. Before the decisive clash, Temujin ordered many campfires lit across the night, making his army appear far larger than it truly was. It was a simple trick, but devastatingly effective. The Nayman saw not just an enemy, but what looked like an unstoppable force descending on them. When battle came at Chakarmat, the pressure was too much. Jamyuga, who had once stood as Temujin's blood brother and later his greatest rival, withdrew instead of holding firm with the Nayman. Their resistance collapsed. Taian Khan was killed, and the Nayman power was shattered. With that victory, more than 30 tribes came under Temujin's authority. The long struggle for the steppe was over. The abandoned boy who had once lived on roots and fish had now crushed every major rival before him. Temujin was no longer merely surviving the world into which he had been born. He had remade it. Part 13. Jamyuga's End and the Birth of Genghis Khan. After the destruction of the Nayman, Jamyuga's long struggle against Temujin was effectively over. Once bound to him by sacred brotherhood, he now became a fugitive, retreating into the mountains with only a small number of followers left at his side. The man who had once stood as Temujin's equal, and for a time perhaps his greatest political rival, was no longer leading the future of the steppe. He was running from it. But even then, betrayal followed him. The last men who remained with Jamyuga eventually seized him and delivered him to Temujin. hoping to save themselves by handing over the defeated rival. What happened next revealed something essential about Temujin's code. He did not reward them. Instead, he ordered the execution of the men who had betrayed their own leader. To Temujin, loyalty mattered more than convenience. A man who would betray his master once could never truly be trusted again. Jamaga himself was also put to death. With his last great rival gone, Temujin stood alone at the top of the steppe. Soon after, he launched new raids against Western Xia. Extending his reach beyond the tribal world he had spent years conquering. Then came the Great Kurultai of 1206, the assembly that changed everything. There, the Mongol nobles formally recognized a new political order that had emerged from years of war, and Temujin received a new title, Genghis Khan. He was no longer only the leader who had unified the Mongols. He was now the ruler of a new empire. Part 14. Building an empire through law, order, and loyalty. Winning the steppe was only the beginning. Many men could conquer. Far fewer could organize what they had taken and turn victory into a system strong enough to survive them. After 1206, Genghis Khan began doing exactly that. He did not want to remain just another tribal warlord at the head of a temporary alliance. He wanted to create a political order that would outgrow the old steppe divisions and bind people to something larger than clan, bloodline, or inherited rank. The men who had stood by him in hardship were rewarded. Loyal companions such as Booku, Barokul, Jeeb, and Subadai were elevated into positions of real importance, not because of noble ancestry, but because they had proved their worth. This was one of the most radical elements of Genghis Khan's rule. On a steppe long shaped by aristocratic privilege, he increasingly promoted men based on merit, loyalty, and usefulness. That choice strengthened him in two ways at once. It gave him highly capable commanders, and it weakened the older tribal elites who might otherwise have challenged his authority. To make this transformation permanent, he reorganized society and the military together. Former tribal loyalties were deliberately broken apart and reassembled into decimal military administrative units of tens, hundreds, thousands, and larger formations. Men who had once belonged first to separate clans were now expected to serve directly under the authority of the Khan. It was a profound shift. Genghis Khan was replacing the fragmented politics of the steppe with a more disciplined imperial structure. At the center of this system stood his personal guard, the Keshik, which expanded into a force of more than 10,000 men. They were not just bodyguards in the narrow sense. They formed a trusted inner institution around the ruler, helping secure order at the heart of the new empire. His four sons, Joki, Shagatai, Jede, and Talui, were also assigned growing responsibilities, though always within a system where loyalty to the state had to stand above private ambition. Alongside military reform came law. Genghis Khan is often associated with a broad legal code known as the Yasa, a body of rules that emphasize discipline, obedience, and order. It could be practical, but it could also be merciless. Many offenses were punishable by death. At the same time, his rule showed a striking degree of religious pragmatism. Clerics, monks, and merchants could receive protection and privileges, and different faiths were often tolerated as long as they did not threaten imperial authority. This was the deeper source of his power. Genghis Khan was not simply conquering lands. He was constructing a state, hard, efficient, loyal, and built to expand. Part 15. How the Mongol war machine was forged by the years after 1206. Genghis Khan was no longer relying on courage alone. He was refining a military machine unlike anything most of his enemies had ever faced. The Mongol army did not become terrifying by accident. It was shaped through discipline, mobility, training, and an understanding of war that reached far beyond simple battlefield bravery. A crucial part of this system was the Keshik, the Imperial Guard. They protected the Khan, but their role extended much further. They helped form the inner framework of the empire, supporting intelligence, communication, organization, and the movement of information. In a world where speed often meant survival, knowing more and moving faster could decide entire campaigns before the main clash ever began. Training was constant. Even the great seasonal hunts were more than hunts. They functioned as large-scale military exercises, forcing men to move in coordination, surround targets over wide distances, and obey commands with precision. What looked like tradition also served as preparation for conquest. The ordinary Mongol warrior was formidable in his own right. He fought on horseback with remarkable skill, carrying powerful bows and large numbers of arrows, and he could strike at speed from a distance with deadly accuracy. Just as important, each rider had multiple horses, allowing Mongol forces to travel with shocking speed across enormous distances. An army that seemed far away could appear with almost no warning. Their tactics made them even more dangerous. They could scatter, regroup, attack from unexpected angles, and pretend to retreat only to lure enemies into disaster. Spoils were shared in a way that reinforced unity, and success in war was tied directly to the loyalty of the men carrying it out. This was why Genghis Khan's armies became the terror of Eurasia. They were not just fierce. They were organized, mobile, disciplined, and built to keep winning. Part 16. Securing the outer frontiers before striking China before Genghis Khan launched his full weight against the great states of northern China. He moved carefully along the edges of his world, securing the lands around him and eliminating threats that might interfere with larger ambitions. These campaigns were not distractions. They were preparation. He was shaping the battlefield long before the main war began. To the north and northwest, Mongol forces extended their reach into the forest regions and steppe frontiers. Jochi campaigned among the peoples of the northern woodlands, while Sabre moved against remaining Merkid elements, continuing the long process of destroying old enemies who still had the potential to regroup. At the same time, the Uyghurs of eastern Turkestan submitted peacefully, an important development that gave Genghis Khan more than territory. It gave him useful administrators and scribes. The Uyghur script was adopted for the earliest official written records of the Mongol state, a sign that conquest in his empire was not only about destruction, but also about absorption and adaptation. To the south lay a far greater prize and a far greater challenge. China was not united. Northern China was dominated by the Jin dynasty, while Western Xia stood to the northwest. And beyond them were other states such as the Karakai and the southern Song farther south. Genghis Khan understood that he could not simply charge blindly into this world of fortified cities and settled kingdoms. The steppe had made him strong, but conquering sedentary states would require testing his army against new kinds of enemies. Western Xia became that test. For Genghis Khan, the Tangut Kingdom was both a source of wealth and a proving ground. Raiding it offered plunder for his followers, but it also allowed the Mongols to measure themselves against a structured state with walls, cities, and a different style of warfare. The campaign ended with Western Xia forced into submission. It was a warning to every power around them. The Mongols were no longer only masters of the steppe. They were learning how to break the gates of the civilized world. Part 17. War with the Jin and the breaking of North China's defenses by 1211. Genghis Khan was ready to launch one of the most important campaigns of his life. The steppe had been unified, the outer frontiers had been secured, and Western Xia had already shown that settled kingdoms could be forced to submit. Now his attention turned fully toward the Jin dynasty, the powerful state that ruled northern China. This was no longer a struggle against scattered tribes or steppe rivals. It was a confrontation with a wealthy, heavily fortified empire that commanded cities, walls, and enormous resources. Genghis Khan did not enter this war recklessly. He prepared a large invasion and divided his forces into multiple columns, allowing the Mongols to move across broad areas, strike from different directions, and prevent the Jin from concentrating their strength in one place. From the opening stage of the campaign, Mongol mobility became a devastating advantage. But they struggled against an enemy that moved faster than expected, struck unpredictably, and refused to fight according to the normal rhythms of conventional war. The early victories were serious enough to shake the confidence of the Jin court. Mongol commanders exploited weak points, broke through defensive lines, and captured cities that helped open the road deeper into northern China. Jib, already proving himself one of Genghis Khan's most brilliant generals, used deception and speed to outmaneuver Jin forces in ways that made the Mongol advance even more dangerous. The campaign pushed toward Jiangdu, the Jin capital, located in what is now Beijing. Yet even with momentum on their side, the Mongols were not fully prepared at that stage to take and hold such a massive fortified city by straightforward assault. So they pulled back, temporarily, after demonstrating just how vulnerable the Jin realm had become. That withdrawal did not mean the danger had passed. It meant the Mongols were learning. When winter came, the Jin recovered some ground and reoccupied a number of positions. But Genghis Khan returned stronger. Between 1212 and 1215, Mongol pressure intensified across the region. Cities were attacked repeatedly, fields were devastated, and the economic life that sustained Jin resistance was deliberately broken apart. This was not warfare aimed only at armies. It was warfare designed to crush a state's ability to endure. At the same time, the Jin court was weakened by internal instability, mistrust, and poor coordination. The empire faced not just invasion from outside, but disorder within. Under that pressure, Mongol attacks became even more effective. The countryside suffered enormously, and the Mongols continued tightening their grip around Jiangdu. In 1215, the city finally fell. The capture of the Jin capital was accompanied by terrible destruction and large-scale plunder, a pattern that would become tragically familiar wherever resistance ended in collapse. The fall of Jiangdu marked a turning point. North China's defenses had been broken open, and the Jin dynasty had lost both prestige and security. Genghis Khan then left Mukhali, one of his most trusted commanders, to continue operations in China, while he began looking westward toward even larger possibilities. The empire he had built was no longer expanding in one direction alone. It was preparing to strike across the breadth of Eurasia. Part 18. Westward into Central Asia, from Karakatai to the destruction of Khwarezm. After breaking the power of the Jin in northern China, Genghis Khan turned his attention west. What lay there was not empty land waiting to be taken, but a chain of states, trade routes, rival rulers, and old political fractures that he would exploit with terrifying efficiency. The first major problem was Karakatai, where a fugitive prince named Kuklug, a name in exile, had carved out power after fleeing the Mongol rise on the steppe. He was more than a distant nuisance. He represented unfinished business, and as long as he remained in control, the western frontier could not be secure. Genghis Khan sent Jib to deal with him. Jib moved with the speed and precision that had already made him indispensable. Kuklug's rule had alienated many of the local Muslim populations, and Jib understood how to turn that resentment into an advantage. Instead of governing through blind destruction alone, he allowed religious tolerance and positioned the Mongols as liberators from an unpopular ruler. It was a deeply practical move, and it worked. Support for Kuklug collapsed, his power unraveled, and Karakatai fell into Mongol hands. With that, Genghis Khan's empire pushed farther into Central Asia, and the road opened toward an even greater confrontation. At first, Genghis Khan did not appear eager for war with the Khwarezmian Empire. Khwarezm was enormous, wealthy, and strategically important, stretching across much of Central Asia and controlling major commercial centers. Genghis Khan's initial interest seems to have been peaceful trade. He sent a caravan of merchants into Khwarezmian territory. expecting commerce, communication, and perhaps the foundation of a stable relationship between the two powers. Instead, he got an outrage. At Otrar, the governor accused the Mongol merchants of being spies. The caravan was seized and the merchants were killed. Even then, Genghis Khan did not immediately rush to war. He sent envoys demanding justice. But the Khwarezmian Shah made the situation even worse. The envoys were insulted and some were killed. That decision sealed the fate of his empire. For Genghis Khan, the matter was no longer diplomatic. It became personal, political, and absolute. What followed was one of the most devastating campaigns of conquest in medieval history. Genghis Khan did not simply march west in a single blunt wave. He prepared carefully, divided his armies, coordinated multiple thrusts, and exploited the internal weaknesses of the Khwarezmian state. The empire looked vast, but it was poorly unified, and the Shah failed to create a solid, coordinated defense. Against a ruler like Genghis Khan, those weaknesses were fatal. The city of Otrar was besieged and eventually fell. Then the Mongols moved deeper. Bukhara, one of the great cities of the Islamic world, was taken. Samarkand, richer and even more important, also collapsed. Everywhere the pattern repeated itself: speed, shock, fragmentation, and the systematic breaking of resistance. Mongol forces did not always attack where they were expected, and they repeatedly appeared in places defenders thought were safe. The psychological effect was almost as destructive as the military one. Entire regions began to understand that no wall, no army, and no distance guaranteed safety. The Shah, Muhammad II, failed to hold his empire together. Rather than organizing a coherent stand, he fled from place to place as Mongol pressure intensified. Genghis Khan's armies kept advancing, and the empire that had seemed so formidable began to disintegrate in front of them. Muhammad eventually died in flight on an island in the Caspian Sea, a broken ruler watching his world collapse behind him. But the destruction did not end there. Other cities suffered even worse. Gurganj became the site of brutal fighting and catastrophic devastation. In Khorasan, Toli led campaigns that brought appalling destruction to urban centers, including Merv and Nishapur. Resistance was answered with massacre on a scale that stunned contemporaries and scarred memory for generations. Some cities were emptied. Others were shattered so completely that they became warnings to the rest of the world. And all of this happened with astonishing speed. In less than 5 years, much of Central Asia had been crushed and brought under Mongol domination. What had begun as a diplomatic insult at Otrar ended in the ruin of one of the great Islamic empires of the age. Genghis Khan had not only expanded west, he had unleashed a storm so violent that entire civilizations seemed to buckle beneath it. By now, his empire no longer belonged to the steppe alone. It stretched across worlds, and the men who carried his banners were not finished yet. Part 19. The Great Raid into the Caucasus and the lands of Rus. Even after the destruction of Khwarezm, the Mongol advance did not simply stop at the borders of Central Asia. Some of Genghis Khan's finest commanders kept moving, pushing farther west in a campaign that felt less like a conventional invasion and more like a terrifying demonstration of how far Mongol reach could extend. Jib and Subdai led this great raid with a force of around 20,000 horsemen, and what they accomplished would become one of the most extraordinary long-range operations in military history. They moved through Persia, across the Caucasus, and into regions that had never before faced an enemy quite like them. Along the way, they fought through powerful local resistance, striking Georgia and moving past mountain barriers that should have slowed or even stopped a lesser army. But Mongol warfare was built on endurance, speed, and constant motion. Their campaign did not depend on holding every piece of ground beneath them. It depended on breaking opposition, gathering intelligence, and spreading fear faster than any settled state could respond. From the Caucasus, they descended into the steppe lands of the Cumans. Under pressure, The Cumans appealed to the princes of Rus for help, and together they formed a coalition against the Mongols. It was a dangerous moment, at least in theory. For the first time, a serious alliance of steppe and Rus forces was gathering to confront the invaders. But Jebe and Subdai understood exactly how to deal with divided enemies. Through maneuver, deception, and careful timing, they drew their opponents into pursuit and stretched the coalition out of formation. The result was the Battle of the Kalka River in 1223, fought in what is now Ukraine. There, the Mongols destroyed the coalition. The Rus princes and their allies were outmaneuvered, broken apart, and crushed. It was a victory that echoed far beyond the battlefield itself. The Mongols did not remain to fully conquer the Rus lands at that moment, but the meaning of the raid was unmistakable. A force sent from the world of Genghis Khan had crossed enormous distances, defeated every enemy in its path, and reached the threshold of Europe. The West had now seen the edge of the storm, and the storm was still growing. Part 20. The final campaign, the death of Genghis Khan, and the legacy he left behind. By 1225, Genghis Khan returned to Mongolia after years of conquest that had transformed him from the ruler of a steppe empire into the master of a vast transcontinental power. But even then, his work was not done. One final campaign still awaited him. Western Shah, the Tangut kingdom that had once submitted to Mongol power, had failed to remain loyal. For Genghis Khan, that was not a small matter of diplomacy. In his world, disobedience from a subject state was a challenge to the order he had built, and challenges of that kind had to be answered completely. So he marched again. This last expedition was not only a punishment campaign, it was also the final expression of the same iron logic that had guided his life for decades. States that submitted could survive under Mongol rule. States that resisted, betrayed, or hesitated at the wrong time could be erased. Genghis Khan led the campaign alongside key members of his inner circle, including Jidai Tolui and Subadai, driving once more into the lands of Western Shah to force total submission. But age and war had taken their toll. At some point during this final period, Genghis Khan suffered a fall from his horse, and although the exact details remain uncertain, his health appears to have declined afterward. Whether the injury directly caused his death or simply worsened an already failing body, the result was clear. The man who had survived hunger, captivity, tribal war, assassination attempts, and decades of near-constant campaigning was approaching the end of his life. Even then, he thought like a ruler. Before his death, he took steps to secure the future of the empire, and a Kurultai confirmed that Gedai would succeed him. That decision mattered enormously. Genghis Khan had built an empire through personal authority, military brilliance, and relentless force. But if the succession collapsed into chaos, everything he had created could have fractured immediately. By placing Gedai in line, he tried to give the empire continuity beyond his own presence. On August 25, 1227, Genghis Khan died at around the age of 65. The exact location of his burial remains one of history's greatest mysteries. That uncertainty somehow fits the man himself. He changed the shape of the known world, yet the final resting place of his body vanished into silence, as if the earth itself had been ordered to keep his secret. His death did not end the Mongol expansion. In many ways, it only opened the next chapter. Under Gedai and later rulers, Mongol armies continued to advance across Eurasia, reaching toward the Mediterranean world, deep into Eastern Europe, across Korea, and into the heart of the Middle East and China. In time, the empire would divide into major khanates, including the Golden Horde, the Sughatai Khanate, the Ilkhanate, and the Yuan realm in China. But all of them emerged from the structure he had built. And that is why Genghis Khan remains such a powerful and unsettling figure in history. He was a military genius, a state builder, and a ruler of extraordinary will. He shattered old political worlds and created new ones. He rewarded loyalty, elevated talent, and forged one of the most effective imperial systems the medieval world had ever seen. But he also unleashed destruction on a colossal scale. Cities burned, populations were massacred, and entire regions were left haunted by the memory of his campaigns. So how should he be remembered? As a brilliant conqueror who remade Eurasia through force, discipline, and vision? Or as a ruthless destroyer whose empire rose on terror and blood? Maybe that is the reason his story still grips us so strongly. Genghis Khan was never just one thing. He was both creator and destroyer, unifier and annihilator, a man born from the cruelty of the steppe who went on to change the fate of continents.